wind found the gap in the barn door first, the way it always did before a storm, threading cold fingers through cracked wood, and Josephine Hartley pressed her palm against her mother's chest just to feel it rise. Snow was already sideways in the yard. The grain silo stood a half-mile off, dark and round against a sky the color of a bruise, and somewhere inside it, buried under blankets and prayer, was the only shelter left to them. If you're just joining this story, you should know something before it truly begins. Some homes are built with lumber and nails. Others are built with stubbornness, with two sisters who refused to let their mother die cold. This is the story of that second kind of home, and of the blizzard that would decide, once and for all, whether it could stand. 3 years earlier, none of this had seemed possible. The Hartley ranch had belonged to their father, and before him to his father, stretching back to the first wagon that had rattled into this stretch of prairie when the grass still grew taller than a man's waist. Josephine and her twin sister Delphine had grown up beneath its roof, had learned to ride before they could properly walk, had buried their father beneath the cottonwood tree at the edge of the north pasture when they were 22 years old and the ground was still soft enough to dig. Their mother, Ruth Hartley, had been 58 then, strong for her age, sharp-eyed, a woman who had outlived 2 hard winters and 1 husband, and had intended, everyone assumed, to outlive a great many things more. She had not intended to outlive her own home. That had been their uncle's doing. Otis Hartley was their father's younger brother, a man with a salesman's smile and a gambler's patience, and when the will was read in the dim little office of the county clerk, it was Otis's name on the paper, not Ruth's, not Josephine's, not Delphine's. A forged signature, everyone would later understand, though understanding it and proving it were 2 very different mountains to climb. The judge, an old friend of Otis's from better days, had not seen fit to climb either. They saw a scoundrel who had gotten away with something ugly. Josephine saw something else. She saw the exact moment her mother's spine, which had never once bent under grief or drought or the death of a husband, bent under the weight of being told she no longer owned the ground beneath her own feet. "We will not beg him," Ruth had said, the night they packed what little they were permitted to take. Her voice did not shake. Her hands did. "Hartleys do not beg." She had no idea yet how true those words would become, or how far her daughters would go to keep her from ever having to break them. The town of Millbrook was not cruel, exactly. It was simply indifferent, the way small towns often are toward misfortune that does not touch them directly. There was sympathy offered at church, casseroles left on borrowed doorsteps, the kind of comfort that costs nothing and changes nothing. But when Josephine asked about work, about land, about any corner of the county where 3 women without a name attached to money might build something of their own, she was met mostly with polite, dismissive silence. Women did not run cattle. Women did not build houses. Women, especially women in their circumstances, waited to be taken in by some man with sense enough to marry them. Josephine did not wait. It was Delphine who found the silo first, outriding the old south trail that nobody used anymore since the Kessler mill had gone under years back. She came back at a gallop, hair loose from its pins, cheeks red from wind and something else. "Josie," she said, breathless, swinging down from the saddle before the horse had fully stopped. "Josie, I found something." "You found trouble is what you found, riding like that." "I found us a house." It did not look like a house. It looked like exactly what it was, an abandoned grain silo. corrugated metal gone rust-orange with age, standing alone on a stretch of unclaimed prairie like a lighthouse with no sea to guard. 20 feet across at the base, 30 feet tall, maybe more. A single door, warped shut, and inside, when the sisters finally forced it open with a crowbar and their combined weight, nothing but dust and old grain husks and a strange, hollow silence that seemed to hold its breath along with them. "It's round," Josephine said, turning in place, looking up at the cone of the roof far above. "Everything's round. Where would Mama even sleep?" "Wherever we build her a place to sleep," Delphine said. "Josie, nobody wants this land. Nobody's claimed it in years. It's ours if we're brave enough to take it." If this story is teaching you anything so far, let it be this. Sometimes what looks like nothing to everyone else is exactly the shape of what you need. The town saw a ruin. The sisters saw walls that would not blow down in wind, a roof that would not leak in rain, 400 square feet of round, sound shelter that no uncle's signature could touch, because no uncle had ever wanted it in the first place. They did not tell their mother right away. Ruth was proud in the particular way of women who have lost everything and have decided that pride is the last thing left worth keeping. And the sisters knew that if she saw the silo before it was ready, she would see only a grain bin, a humiliation, a public admission of how far the Hartleys had fallen. So they worked in secret, riding out before dawn and returning after dark, hands blistered, backs aching, telling their mother only that they had found seasonal work mending fences for a rancher 2 counties over. It was, in its way, not entirely a lie. They were mending something. It simply was not a fence. The work itself nearly broke them both. Neither sister had ever built anything larger than a chicken coop, and the silo demanded skills neither of them possessed, and had to learn by doing, by failing, by doing again. Delphine, always the more physical of the two, took to the heavy labor, hauling in second-hand lumber for a floor raised above the cold ground, learning from a borrowed book how to frame a proper doorway inside the curved metal wall. Josephine, quieter, more exacting, worked out how to seal the gaps where wind found its way through old rivet holes, how to build a small stove platform that would not set the whole structure ablaze, how to run a stovepipe up through a hole cut carefully in the roof and flashed against rain with scavenged tin. They had no wood carvings to soften the walls, no time or money for such things, and so the beauty of the place, when it slowly began to emerge, was not decorative but structural. It was the beauty of a wall that finally stopped leaking, of a floor that no longer gave beneath a boot, of a door that swung shut and actually, truly, kept the cold out. There had been a stranger who found them at their work one gray October afternoon, an older man named Ezra Whitfield, who had once built grain elevators for a living before the railroads changed everything, and who happened to be passing the old Kessler Trail on some errand of his own. He sat his horse at the edge of the clearing for a long while, watching the 2 young women wrestle a length of stovepipe into place before he finally called out, "You know that thing'll hold a man's weight walking the rafters if you brace it right," he said. "Most folks don't know that about a silo." Josephine straightened, wiping her hands on her skirt, wary. "We didn't ask for company." "Didn't come looking to give it." Whitfield swung down slow, joints stiff, and walked a wide, considering circle around the base of the structure, running a palm along the seams the way a doctor might feel for a fever. "This here's good steel. Better'n half the houses in Millbrook, truth told. Round walls don't fight the wind. They let it slide right past." "You girls didn't stumble into this by accident, did you?" "We stumbled into it by necessity," Delphine said. Whitfield's eyes moved between them, taking their measure, and something in his weathered face softened. "Necessity builds truer than money ever has. I'll tell you that for nothing." He glanced up at the roof, at the careful flashing around the stovepipe. "Whoever taught you to seal a roof like that knew what they were about." "Nobody taught us," Josephine said. "We had a book, and we had to." He nodded slowly, as though that answer satisfied something in him. "Well, you've built it sound. I'd stake my own roof on that judgment, and I've built more of these than most men living." He paused, and something almost like respect crossed his face. "Storm's coming this winter. Old bones like mine, we feel it early. You'll want that stove drawn strong before the first real snow." He rode off without another word, and the sisters stood watching him go, and neither one said aloud what they were both thinking: that a stranger, a man who owed them nothing, had looked at their impossible little home and called it sound. It was the first time anyone besides each other had believed in what they were building. She had no idea yet how much she would need to remember his words when the storm he warned of finally came. By the time the first frost silvered the grass in earnest, the silo was ready. Not fine, not what their mother's old house had been, with its wide porch and its glass windows and its rooms enough for a family to spread out and breathe, but warm, dry, theirs. They brought Ruth out on a Sunday afternoon, told her only that they had a surprise, and watched her face as she stood in the doorway of the round little house her daughters had built with their own hands. She did not speak for a long moment. She walked the small circumference of the floor, touched the curved wall, ran her fingers along the seam where Josephine had packed rag and tar into a gap that had once let in daylight and now let in nothing at all. She stopped in front of the little stove, its pipe rising straight and true through the roof above, and she pressed her palm flat against its cold iron side as though checking a sleeping child for fever. "You built this," she said. It was not a question. "We built this," Delphine said. Ruth's chin trembled just once before she caught it and steadied it the way she had steadied everything else these 3 long years. "Your father would have called this foolishness." "Would he?" Josephine said quietly. "No," Ruth admitted. "No, he wouldn't have. He'd have called it heartly stubbornness. He'd have been right." She looked up at her daughters, and for the first time since the day the will was read, something in her face was not merely enduring. It was, almost, at peace. "I raised you both to bend before you break. I never expected you'd learn to build a wall that wouldn't do either." That winter, they made the round little silo into something that could, without too much shame, be called a home. Delphine traded a week of her labor to a neighboring rancher in exchange for a second-hand cook stove in better repair than the one they'd salvaged. Josephine sewed heavy curtains to hang across the sleeping alcove they'd framed in for their mother, giving her some small privacy from the main room. They laid braided rugs against the cold of the raised floor. They hung a single small mirror, a wedding gift of Ruth's that Otis had somehow overlooked in his taking of everything else, on the curved wall beside the door, and Ruth touched its frame every morning as though greeting an old friend who had followed her into exile. It was not the house they had lost. It would never be the house they had lost. But it stood, and every night that it stood against the wind, it seemed to Josephine like a small, quiet victory over everything that had been taken from them. It was in the spring that Nathaniel Cross came to Millbrook, hired on to help drive a herd through the county on its way to the rail line further west. And it was chance, or something that only pretended to be chance, that brought him past the old Kessler Trail one evening when his borrowed horse threw a shoe within sight of the silo's rusted roof. Josephine found him first, walking the limping animal slow along the fence line, and something about the careful, unhurried way he handled the horse, speaking low and even, made her set down the hatchet she'd been using to split kindling and walk out to meet him. "You're a fair way from the road," she said. Horse had other plans than mine. He nodded toward the silo behind her, its stovepipe trailing a thin ribbon of smoke into the evening sky. "Didn't expect to find a house way out here. Thought this was empty land." It was. Something in the flatness of her answer seemed to tell him not to ask further, and she found she liked him a little for that. He was quiet in a way Millbrook men rarely were, unwilling to fill silence just for the sound of his own voice. And when Delphine came out to see about the commotion and immediately began peppering him with questions about the herd and the trail and where exactly a man his age had learned to shoe a horse so poorly, he answered each one plainly, without embarrassment. And something in his easy patience with her sister's bluntness told Josephine more about his character than a month of Sunday conversations could have. He stayed the night in the small lean-to shed they'd built onto the silo's north side for tools and firewood, refusing Ruth's offer of a place nearer the stove, saying he'd caused enough trouble for one evening, and in the morning he was gone before full light, leaving only a note of thanks pinned to the shed door and, strangely, the horse's old thrown shoe set neatly on the step, as though it were something worth keeping. He came back 3 weeks later, and then, not quite by coincidence, 3 weeks after that. Nathaniel had grown up on a ranch 2 territories over, the son of a father who had also lost land, though to drought rather than deceit, and there was something in him that recognized, without needing to be told, the particular grief of a family stripped of what should have been theirs. He never asked the sisters to explain the silo, never treated their strange round home as anything less than exactly what it was, a house, built by hands that had refused to accept homelessness as their fate. When he began helping with small repairs, reinforcing the door hinge, clearing brush from around the base before fire season, it was never framed as charity. It was simply what a person did for people he had come to care for. "You didn't have to fix that latch," Josephine told him one evening, watching him test the door's swing with a critical eye. "Didn't have to do a lot of things," he said. "Man does what feels right anyway." She had no answer for that beyond a small, private smile she did not let him see, and if you have ever felt your heart shift quietly toward someone without quite deciding to let it, you will understand exactly what was happening to Josephine Hartley in that moment, whether she was ready to admit it or not. By late autumn, no one in Millbrook could pretend any longer that the sisters had simply vanished to work fences. Word travels on the prairie the way fire travels through dry grass, and eventually someone, perhaps a rancher who'd sold them lumber, perhaps Whitfield himself, let slip the truth of the strange round house on the old Kessler Trail. The town's reaction was not kind. Two unmarried women and their mother living in a converted grain bin like squatters, like something less than proper folk. There was talk. There was the particular cruelty of small towns that dresses itself up as concern. Ruth Hartley, they whispered, had raised her daughters into something unnatural, something that had forgotten its place. Josephine heard the whispers at the general store and said nothing, only paid for her flour and left with her chin high the way her mother had taught her. But that night, alone at the edge of the silo's small clearing, she allowed herself just once to weep. Delphine found her there, said nothing at first, only sat beside her in the cold grass and put an arm around her shoulders. "Let them talk," Delphine finally said. "Let every last one of them talk themselves hoarse. We are warm tonight. Mama is warm tonight. When has their opinion ever kept anyone warm?" Josephine laughed, despite herself, a wet, broken little sound. "You always did know how to put a thing plainly. Somebody in this family has to." They sat together a long while beneath a sky just beginning to spit the season's first flakes of snow, and neither of them yet knew how soon those flakes would become something far more dangerous. Remember that quiet moment. Hold on to it, because the storm that would test everything they had built was already gathering, far off across the plains, though neither sister could see it yet. The blizzard came in the second week of December, and it came the way the worst ones always do on the open prairie, without proper warning, without mercy. A sky that had been merely gray at dawn, turning to something closer to iron by noon, the wind rising in pitch until it screamed rather than merely blew. Josephine had been in town that morning, trading eggs for salt and coffee, and it was old Ezra Whitfield, of all people, who found her on the road and pulled his wagon up hard beside her. "Get home," he said. No greeting, no preamble. "Get home now, girl. My bones haven't been wrong yet." She did not need telling twice. She rode hard the whole way, snow already needling sideways against her cheeks by the time the silo's dark shape rose out of the whitening land ahead of her, and she found Delphine already at the door, wrestling the last of the split firewood inside, face pale and set. "Mama's fever's up," Delphine said, before Josephine had even swung down from the saddle. "Started an hour ago. Bad cough with it." Inside, Ruth lay on her narrow bed behind the curtained alcove, cheeks flushed too bright, breath rattling faintly in her chest in a way that made both daughters' hearts seize with a fear neither would say aloud. Outside, the wind had begun its long, low howl, the particular sound of a true blizzard settling in for a fight, and Josephine understood with a clarity that felt like cold water down her spine that there would be no riding for the doctor tonight, no riding anywhere tonight. Whatever happened in the hours ahead would happen inside these round metal walls, and nowhere else. If this story has taught you anything up until now, understand this: everything the sisters had built, every seam sealed, every gap packed tight, every careful hour spent learning what neither of them had been taught, had been building toward this single night, though neither of them had known it at the time. The silo was no longer simply a home. It was about to become the only thing standing between their mother and the cold that wanted to take her. Josephine fed the stove until its iron sides glowed faintly orange in the dim light, banking it as high as she dared without fear of fire, while Delphine knelt beside their mother, pressing cool cloths to her brow, murmuring the same soft reassurances she had murmured as a child whenever either sister had taken sick. "Fever's climbing," Delphine said quietly, not wanting Ruth to hear the fear in her voice, though Ruth, half lucid, seemed to hear it anyway. "Don't fuss," Ruth managed, though the words came thin and cracked. "Just a cold." Always did make too much fuss. "We'll fuss as much as we please," Josephine said, coming to kneel on her mother's other side. "You've earned every bit of our fussing, and more besides." Outside, the wind had begun to find every weakness the silo possessed. Testing seams Josephine had thought sealed for good, and twice that night she rose to check the stovepipe flashing, to feel along the curved walls for any hint of a new draft, remembering, as she did, Ezra Whitfield's words from that gray October afternoon so many months before. "This here's good steel. Whoever taught you to seal a roof like that knew what they were about." She prayed, silently, fervently, that he had been right. It was near midnight when the storm reached its worst, the wind screaming loud enough to drown out speech, the small stovepipe rattling in its seat, and it was in that hour, with the whole world outside gone white and howling and merciless, that a fist began pounding against the door. Delphine went rigid. "Who in God's name?" Josephine was already moving, hand on the latch, bracing herself against the wind she knew would try to tear the door from her grip the moment it opened. When she hauled it wide, snow blasted in sideways, and standing in the swirling white beyond was a shape she did not at first recognize, coated in ice, staggering, nearly past standing. "Nathaniel!" He half fell across the threshold, and between the two sisters they hauled him the rest of the way in and shut the door hard against the storm's furious grasp. He was nearly frozen through, his borrowed horse lost somewhere behind him in the whiteout, and it took long minutes of blankets and the stove's banked heat before he could speak proper words instead of shivering fragments. "Got caught out," he finally managed, teeth still chattering. "Heard scattered in the wind. Saw your stovepipe smoke before the snow closed in complete. Followed it. Followed it the whole way, near enough." "You could have died out there," Josephine said, her voice rougher than she intended, fear and relief tangled too close together to separate. "Nearly did." He managed a small, exhausted smile, eyes finding hers even through his shivering. "Worth the risk. Knew this house would hold." There was no time that night for anything more tender than that. Ruth's fever had climbed higher still, her breathing gone shallow and quick, and it was Nathaniel, once feeling had returned enough to his hands, who proved to have learned something of doctoring from a mother who'd raised 5 children on an isolated ranch with no physician for 50 miles in any direction. "Needs steam," he said, kneeling by Ruth's bed, feeling her pulse with 2 fingers pressed careful to her wrist. "Needs her chest opened up, or that cough will settle deep and turn worse." They worked through the deepest hours of the night by lamplight, boiling water on the stove and holding Ruth upright to breathe the rising steam, layering every blanket the small house possessed around her thin shoulders, and outside the wind screamed on, unrelenting, as though testing every rivet and seam the sisters had sealed a year before, as though the whole cruel prairie had decided this single night to demand its answer to the question the sisters had been asking all along. Was the house sound? Was it truly, finally, theirs? Near dawn, Ruth's breathing eased. It was not sudden, not miraculous, only a slow, gradual loosening, her chest rising fuller, her color returning by careful degrees, and when at last she opened her eyes clear and looked up at the three exhausted faces bent over her, she managed a small, wry smile. "Made quite a fuss over a cold," she rasped. Delphine let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob, and pressed her forehead briefly to her mother's hand. Josephine felt her own eyes burn, and did not bother hiding the tears this time, and Nathaniel, still wrapped in a blanket himself, sat back against the curved metal wall and simply watched the three of them, something quiet and certain settling into his tired face. The blizzard raged 2 full days more before it finally broke, and when it did, when the sisters finally dared to open the door onto a world gone entirely white and still, they found the prairie transformed. Drifts taller than a grown man in places, the old Kessler Trail utterly erased beneath the snow. But the silo stood. Every seam had held. Every wall had done exactly what 2 stubborn young women, working with borrowed books and blistered hands, had built it to do. Word of that night traveled through Millbrook faster than the storm itself had. Perhaps it was Nathaniel who told it first, or perhaps it was simply the plain, undeniable fact of it, that the strange, round house on the old Kessler Trail had stood through the worst blizzard in a decade, while sturdier-looking homes closer to town had lost roofs and windows, and in one tragic case, a life. Whatever the reason, the whispers that had once painted the Hartley women as unnatural began, slowly, grudgingly, to change their shape. It was Ezra Whitfield who said it plainest, standing in the general store some weeks later, within easy earshot of half the town. "Told those girls their silo was sound. Turns out I was right, and half of Millbrook's fine houses were wrong. Funny how that shakes out." Even Otis Hartley, it was said, heard the story, though whether shame or something quieter moved in him afterward, no one could say for certain. He did not come to apologize. Some wounds, this story has learned, are not resolved with words at all, only with time and with the slow, undeniable proof of a life rebuilt despite everything taken from it. The sisters did not seek him out for reckoning. They had never needed his ruin to prove their own worth. They had only ever needed a roof that would hold, and a mother kept warm beneath it, and in the end that had been more than enough. Spring came slow that year, as it always does after a hard winter, but it came. The snow receded from the prairie in patches, revealing grass flattened but not broken, ready, as it always was, to grow again. Nathaniel stayed on past the herd he'd been hired to drive, finding steady work at a neighboring ranch, and it surprised no one, least of all Josephine herself, when he began appearing at the silo, not merely to check on Ruth's health, but simply to sit with Josephine in the evenings, watching the sun go down, gold and quiet, over land that had finally, truly become theirs. He asked her to marry him on a warm evening in May, kneeling not with rings or grand speeches, but with the same plain, unhurried honesty he'd shown her from the very first evening his horse had thrown a shoe within sight of her stovepipe smoke. "I've got no house to offer you," he said. "Not yet. Only myself, and whatever we might build together." Josephine, who had learned better than anyone alive what two stubborn hands could build from nothing at all, did not hesitate. "Then we'll build it," she said, "the way we built everything else, one wall at a time." They were married that autumn in the small white church at the edge of Millbrook, the same church whose congregation had once whispered so cruelly about unnatural women living in a converted grain bin. Ruth stood at her daughter's side, strong and steady, the fever of that terrible blizzard night now nothing more than a story told over supper. Delphine stood as well, unmarried still, but in no hurry, having found in the silo's round walls and the wide, waiting prairie beyond them a life entirely her own, one she had built with her own two hands and had no intention of trading away lightly. If you have stayed with this story through every hard winter and every quiet victory, you already understand its truest lesson. A home is not the deed that names it, nor the family that steals it away. A home is what stands through wind and snow and every cruel whisper the world can offer, because someone loved it enough to build it strong. The Hartley sisters lost a house once, lost it to a man's forged signature and a judge's easy friendship, and the world had expected that loss to be the end of their story. It was only the beginning. They kept the silo standing long after Ruth's passing, years later, peaceful and warm in her sleep, beneath the same round roof her daughters had built her. And it became in time something of a local legend. The strange round house on the old Kessler Trail that had outlasted a blizzard no other structure in the county had survived unscathed. Children in Millbrook grew up hearing the story second-hand of two sisters who had taken a rusted grain bin and made it a fortress against the worst the prairie could offer. And more than a few young women in the years that followed found themselves standing before that same round door, asking the sisters, now older, now settled, how exactly a person went about building something out of nothing when the whole world insisted it could not be done. Josephine always gave them the same answer. "You start with the walls," she would say. "Everything else follows, if you're stubborn enough to see it through." And if this story moved you tonight, if you found yourself holding your breath through that long, howling night in the storm, remember the sisters who refused to let the world's cruelty become the end of their story. Remember that sometimes the home that saves you is not the one you were given, but the one you dared to build yourself, one cold, blistered, stubborn hour at a time. If this story touched you, let us know in the comments below. Share it with someone who needs reminding that even the smallest, strangest shelter, built with enough love and enough will, can stand against any storm the world sends its way. And if you want more stories like this one, be sure to like this video and subscribe for more tales of frontier grit, quiet resilience, and the families who refused to break. Thank you for staying with us until the very end.